Didn't work. Hold on one more second. Hello and welcome to JavaScript Marathon Training presented by This.Labs. My name is Sarah Renaud with This.Labs and I will be your host today. We're excited to bring you our next session, JavaScript Animations. Today's trainer is Christina Gorton, Open Source Community Manager at dev.to. Welcome to JavaScript Marathon, Christina. We're happy to have you.
Hello.
You can find Christina on Twitter using the handle shown at the bottom of the screen, Coffee Craft Code. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions or feedback. Of course, JavaScript Marathon would not be possible without our sponsors. Our sponsor today is This.Labs, your partners in modern digital transformation. We specialize in mentorship, consulting, training, and staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. Find out more at this.labs.com or send us an email at hi@this.co. Do you find keeping up with constantly evolving technologies a struggle? Do you want to bring your team up to speed on one of the latest technologies? This.Labs offers personalized training programs to suit your organizational needs, ensuring you and your company stay on the leading edge. Contact us today at hi@this.co to set up your complimentary needs assessment. Check out these upcoming special events. This Friday, GraphQL Madrid meetup is back with number 3 at 12 p.m. Eastern. Also, check out our global meetups in Angular, GraphQL, React, and Vue. More details are available at this.co. We also have a huge announcement. We are back next month. So JavaScript Marathon returns Wednesday, October 28th. Check out our specific session descriptions and RSVP by heading to our blog at this.labs.com. And with that, I'm so happy to hand it over to Christina.
All right. I saw Nick in the chat. Hi, Nick. That's my coworker. So who am I? I'm Christina Gorton. I am the open source community manager now at Dev or Forum. It is a blogging platform for developers or people in tech, or Forum is for communities in general. So it's really cool. Before that, I was a technical writer, a front-end developer, an instructor. I've done a bunch of things in tech. More relevant to you all is probably that I've been an instructor for GreenSock, for CSS Animations, for React, for a lot of things. And I've also been a front-end developer where I did focus a lot on animations. I worked with 2 companies where I was primarily working with GreenSock Animations, and that is what we're going to be working with today. So let's get, there we go. So GreenSock is the animation library we'll be working with. There are lots of JavaScript animation kind of libraries you can work with. Reason I like GreenSock, reason a lot of people like GreenSock is it's super performant. It is cross-browser compatible. If you've ever worked with animations before, you've probably had some weird bugs happen on like Google or Chrome compared to like Firefox. This makes it so that you don't have those problems. It works well across devices. So your laptop, your phone, you can have nice animations. It's also a lot less painful to create complex animations, which I do a lot of, and that's why I really love this. I love CSS animations. I have courses on CSS animations. They are a pain when you want to have a complex animation, and so that's why I use GreenSock. I have some terminology here that I'll kind of be talking about today, so I want to make sure I say what they are beforehand. So GreenSock and GSAP, you're going to be hearing me say both. GreenSock is the company. It's also the animation library, but it's also referred to as GSAP, and we'll be using GSAP as a method and other things. So you'll see that word as well. SVGs are something else that you'll hear me say a lot. Whether you have worked with SVGs or not, they are scalable vector graphics. If you have a PNG or a JPEG, just a regular image on the web, scalable vector graphics are similar, except that you can actually manipulate them. They are code, so you can interact with them, you can program them. They are very performant, unlike say like a PNG where you stretch it. and it gets distorted. A scalable vector graphic, you can actually scale very, very tiny or very, very large, and you're not going to have that problem where it looks off. So your image is always going to be crisp. And I use SVGs a lot. Other words you'll hear me say today are tweens, timelines, and then probably I'll mention plugins at some point, which is these aren't like words that are exclusive necessarily to GreenSock, but they are words you'll hear a lot with GreenSock. Okay, so let's first talk about tweens. We're not going to have too many slides, don't worry. We're going to get into the code, but I do want to talk about them a little bit before we get in. My goal for you all today is to start with the really basics, because I don't know where people are with animations. So we're going to start with a basic tween and then move on to what's called a timeline, where you can create more complex animations. And then if we have time, maybe get into a plugin, but I'm not sure we'll have time for that. Okay, so first, a tween. A tween is not just a GreenSock thing, but you will hear it a lot in GreenSock. It is a single movement between an animation. You can think of states. So my state initially is this thing is not visible, and then I animate it so it's visible. It's that in-between state. So that's where they got tween from. It is an animation word. In GSAP, a tween looks like this. You have gsap.method. It's not actually method. You'll see the methods we're going to be using in a second. You have the element you want to actually animate, and then you have this thing called a vars object. That probably didn't really help, so let's break down the syntax a little bit more, and then we'll look at actually creating some of the syntax. So method refers to the GSAP method you'd like to tween with. There's .to, .from, and .from2. And I'm not going to explain those all right now. I'll explain them when we're coding with them, because it will be a little bit easier. There used to be more. GreenSock recently updated to their version 3, and you had other methods previously. So some of my old stuff, my old blog posts, my old course, other people's courses, you may see some other ones like Stagger 2 or things like that that you don't necessarily have to use now, because you can put Staggers, which we'll go over later, inside of your vars object. So the element is the element you want to animate. If you want to have a good visual of this, it's like saying query selector or query selector all and grabbing a class or an ID or just the element itself, like an H2. And GreenSock will do that for you just by putting the element in that you want to animate. You can also have an array of elements if you want to animate more than just one thing. And then vars is an object of properties you want to animate. So you're going to have a key value pair, something like scale and then 1 or x 200. These are going to go inside that vars object. All right, and then while I will share this out probably on Twitter later, this whole presentation that has all these links. But for now, when I am animating with GreenSock, two things I almost always have open is the GreenSock docs. So their documentation is really good. And then something called an ease visualizer that they have as well. The ease visualizer is probably my favorite resource that they have. I use this all the time. You can really, really change up your animations depending on the ease you give it. If you've ever worked with CSS animations, then you may have tried to come up with a custom, what's called a cubic Bezier ease, and that gives you this custom type ease. They can be hard to create, but GreenSock has them built in. So like this, it bounces. This, it's elasticy. These are all built in, and you can just use them by saying ease and then which one you want. The visualizer is nice because you can see these eases before you use them, and you can see them in different ways. Like this is like a box or a clock. And so these are all super helpful. Okay. And then to get started, we're going to start with GSAP .to method, and we're going to use Codepen. So I'm using Codepen. It's just something I like to use when I'm teaching people, and it works really well with GreenSock, because even if you wanted to get into some of the more advanced plugins that they have that usually cost money, they offer them for free on Codepen. So I'm going to be using Codepen. All right, so this is my little mini challenge that I'm going to be showing you how to get started with tweening. So this is the one I'm going to be using. Let's see if I can put it into our chat. No, I can't. So that's okay. So I will just show you the code then. We'll work through the code together. All right, so what I want to do is I want to show you how to tween, how to move something, how to animate something on the web. That's your basics here with GreenSock. So the first thing we're going to go over is how do you move something left or right on the web? In CSS, you would do something like transform, and then you would translate. It's starting to rain really hard here because I'm in Costa Rica and it's the rainy season, so I apologize if you're if you hear that. But we have transform, and then you would translate either on what's called the x-axis, the y-axis, or both. And so you could do translate X, which would move things left and right on the web. With GSAP, you can just use an X. So we're going to see this. We're going to do GSAP.to. That's one of our methods that we can use. That means we want to start at our initial state and move to something, or go to something. So GSAP.to, and then you put in the element you want to animate. We look in our HTML, we have classes for all these boxes. They all have the same box class because they have some similar styling on them. And then I gave them all each a different class to animate with. So I'm going to say dot box 1. So we'll move that one first. And something very important that I forgot all the time, still forget sometimes, is that before you open up this vars object, you need to have a comma. If you don't have a comma, nothing's going to work. You're not going to have an animation happen. So this right here, this dot box 1, this is acting like document.query selector. It's grabbing that element for you. All right. And one of my kids is trying to come in. I'm on a meeting. I have 4 children. They try to come in all the time. Okay. So our box, we want to move it left or right. I'm going to say X. So instead of having to do transform, translate X, with GreenSock, they know that we use that a lot with animating. We're going to move stuff around on the web a lot, so they've shortened it down just to X. And so if I want to move left or right, I can either give it a positive number or a negative number. So let's try positive first. I'm going to say 20. All right, now we see that element move. So it just moved a little bit over. It moved 20 pixels. If you don't have anything specific, like inside here, where I'm saying like 20%, I want to move over to 20%, then it's going to think you're just talking about pixels. So if you put 20, you have pixels going. Now, if I wanted to move the other way, I would say negative 20. All right, now our box is moving the other way. This right here says, make one of the divs move left and or right. So if we wanted to move left and right at the same time, we could do a couple different things. So GSAP had a couple other methods. They had the dot to, then they had dot from to. What this is doing is you're going to say, I want to have a starting position somewhere, or a starting something happening somewhere, and I want to go to something else. So we could set it at, say, like negative 200, and then you open up another vars object. That's why this one looks a little bit weird than the dot to or dot from. You open up another vars object and you say, okay, at what state do I want this to go to? Where do I want it to end up? And so let's just say x 200. So now I'm going to go from that negative 200 pixels all the way over to the 200. And then if I wanted it to do both, like go back and forth, you have 2 other properties you can use in GreenSock that I use a lot. So the first one is yo-yo. If you know CSS animations at all, this is like saying alternate. So you're going back and forth between your states. So I'm going to say yo-yo true. And then I want to repeat. So along with the yo-yo, you're usually repeating, and you can put a number. I'll say 3 for now. So we see it happen. It's going to repeat 3 times. It's going to go back and forth. So we have our element here starting at negative 200 pixels, going to 200 pixels, and then it is repeating itself. The other thing that's cool with repeat is if you wanted this to just infinitely happen, you wanted it to go all the time, all you have to do is say -1. And then it's always going to be repeating. All right. So that it's not always repeating right now, we're going to comment it out. All right. And then now we want to see, how do you move things up and down? So we've moved left and right. That's cool. How do you move things up and down? And I'm going to make sure we're good. Yeah, I couldn't give out the Codepen URL. I do actually have it in a blog post. I'm not able to put it in the chat, unfortunately. So sorry about that. I will put it out on Twitter later, though. So we want to move up and down, and we're going to use the same initial one, gsap.to. And then I'm just going to grab the next box. So .box2. And then I'm going to open up my vars object here. And the way you move things up and down on the web is with the y-axis. You have an x-axis that goes horizontal, and then you have a y-axis that goes up and down. Okay, buddy, I'm in a meeting. I'm in a meeting. Can you go out? Sorry, I have 4 kids, like I said, and they're trying to come in here. All right, so we're going to use y. And our y-axis, if we want to move up, which is a little bit different on the web than you might be thinking, you use a negative number. That's something that catches people a lot. If you want to go up, you're going to say negative 100. So this is 100 pixels. And then our second box is going to move up. If we want to move down, we'll say 100 pixels so that it goes 100 pixels down the y-axis. All right. We could do the same thing that we did before, that from to, and we could repeat it and do a yo-yo. You can also add in, so a yo-yo here, true, and then repeat 3 again, we'll put, and then it's going to start at its initial state, which is at 0 on the x and y axis, and go down 100 3 times. All right, now I'm going to show you scale, because there's actually a couple things you can do with scaling. It's not just scaling something bigger or smaller. There are other things you can do with it. So we're going to look at that real quick. So I'm going to do gsap.to again. And then inside there, I'm going to grab, let's comment out this so that we're not getting that over and over. I'm going to grab box 3. Okay. And then open up that vars object. And I'm going to say scale. It's just like CSS where you have a transform scale. You just use the scale property. And then I could say, if you want to scale something up, you go above 1. If you want to scale it down, you go below 1. So if I said 0.5, it's going to go half its size. So it's going to scale down to half its size. All right. Now, the other thing you can do is you can scale on just one or other of the axes. So you can say scale X, and then you're going to see it shrink on the X axis, and you can say scale Y, and you'll see it shrink on the Y axis. And if I wanted to go bigger, I could do a big number. Let's do a giant number. Let's say 10. So now it's going to go 10 times its size. While that seems a little extreme, this isn't far-fetched for the web. If you think about like clicking on something on the web, like say you clicked on some kind of box for information and then some modal came out and grew, that would be one of the ways to animate that in. So you would just scale it up really big. Okay, And then the other thing I want to show you with scale is you can change the animation a lot. Let's go back to making it small, so giant. You can change the way this scales a lot by changing another property called transform origin. Okay, and to show you this transform origin and how it works, I'm going to go over to Mozilla. So I'm going to say transform origin, Mozilla. And they have some good examples of what you're transforming. So with CSS, your transforms always start up at the top here on the X and the Y axis. So you have your X and your Y axis, and this is starting up at the top. Right here, they say, okay, I want to rotate at the center. So they just put center. For this one, they said top left. So you can change where your animations are happening by changing that transform origin. You could go over just by pixels. So over 50 pixels and down 50 pixels on the X and Y axis. And so that's a good visual. If you're doing this for the first couple times, you don't exactly know where things are moving or how they're moving. Going to something like this on Mozilla is really helpful to see and play around with. You can even go in here and edit if you want to. So top, center. So it's center on the X axis and top on the Y axis. All right, so our thing is scaling. Let's try that top left. And this won't, by the way, this won't work. You need to put it inside parentheses if you're writing out anything besides a number. So we'll do top left, and then we'll watch it shrink. So it's shrinking up towards this top left here. If I went all the way down, you'd probably see it even better. Everything's going into that just little top left corner of the X and the Y axis. Okay, and then the last general one I'm going to show you before we get into something a little bit cooler called Staggers is how to fade in and out things. And the reason I'm showing you these ones is because transforms and opacity are the most performant way to animate. And you can animate lots and lots of properties. With GreenSock, with CSS, you can animate all kinds of things. But the most performant thing to animate, because you're not causing what's called a repaint or a relayout of the browser every time you animate it, is transforms and opacity. So I want to make sure you know how to use those. So this time I'll use a from. So I'm going to say gsap.from. And I'm going to pick box. I think we're on to box 4 here. So we'll do .box 4. And open up that bars object. And I'm going to say opacity 0. And that happened really fast. So the other property you can use to slow down or speed up your animations is duration. And that's saying, okay, I want this to happen over this amount of time. This whole animation should happen over, let's pick a long time, let's say 4 seconds. So now we're going to have this box animating in over 4 seconds. And the reason it's coming in is it's starting at, we're saying we want to go from opacity 0 to 1. Most of the time I'm not using froms. A lot of people do. Sometimes I do too. Most of the time I'm using a gsap.to, and so I would want to say 1 here. So I want to go, to opacity 0, and then it would fade out instead. So now it's fading out over 4 seconds. Okay, before I get to the next one, which is Staggers, I do want to stop, pause a second and see if you all have any questions. So I know right now we're kind of in inception with this going on, but I want to see if you all have any questions. There is a little bit of a delay, so I'm going to give you some time. So Nick, yes, you can use a variable that represents a DOM object. You could go ahead and say, hey, let box equal document.query selector, and then grab the box, and then you can use that instead. You don't have to put it in parentheses if you're using a variable. You can also use refs if you're working with React or Vue, or I imagine other frameworks, those are just the two I've worked with GreenSock, you have to reference DOM elements, and so you can use those refs instead of grabbing a CSS selector. All right, just giving you all a few more seconds, and if not, then we're going to move on to Staggers, which is one of my favorites. All right, cool. I'll come back and check too to see. But so what we're going to check next is Staggers. And this is the GreenSock docs. If in Google you just say GreenSock docs, you're going to find this link. Unfortunately, I can't share links in the chat. Otherwise, I would share this out to you. So inside the docs, which are right here on GreenSock's website, you can go down. I'm making sure I'm in what's called version 3. There is a version 2 still that's supported. Version 3 is a little bit different as far as the syntax goes. And so I'm in version 3. I can see that here. And then I'm looking at Staggers. And I want to show you just kind of this interactive demo first before we do it. So the nice thing about Staggers is if you had a bunch of elements that either you had created an array out of, or you had, say, the same class on all of them, and you wanted to animate them all, and you said something like scale, which I think this is doing right now, or it's moving, everything's scaling down. If you said scale, everything would happen at the same time. So all of these little divs that are in here would all scale down immediately at the same time. With Stagger, you can pick that array or those classes, and you can say, no, I want to stagger this animation. And then you can get even cooler with it. You can say, I want to start at the end, so the last one. Or I want to start at the edges. Or I want to start randomly. Or even pick one of the numbers in the index. You have a lot of control here. And then the other thing is that you can even pick those axes we've been talking about, the X or the Y. So you can say only trigger this on the X axis, or only trigger this on the Y axis. And the way you do that is you can either do it simple. There's a simple way where you just inside that bars object, you say stagger, and then how many seconds between each you want to stagger. Or you can get more advanced and you can have the stagger have its own object as well, where you're putting in these different properties. I'm going to touch on a few of them real quick before we see the code, just because you're going to see them a lot if you use Staggers. So amount and each are something you're going to see one or the other of. Some people think they're synonymous, they're not. So amount, you're saying all of those boxes that were happening, if I put, I want this to happen, the amount to be 1, and I had 100 boxes, then they would all divide equally from 1. So you would have 0.01 seconds, like it says here, between each time that animation starts. If you say each and you say 1, you're saying this should take 1 second, then this one, then this one, then this one. So they should only happen 1 second after each other. So they are different. This one gives you a little bit more control of and not having to like necessarily do the math. This one makes your animations pretty easily happen like more rapidly than maybe you would be able to do with each. And then from is saying where from in your array of objects that you, or your array of elements that you have, where do you want this to happen from? Where do you want that animation to start? And you can pick that. I don't use grid very often, but there is a way to do it with a grid. I probably use one of these more often, start or end or center. And then the other thing that I think is cool, which I will show you the difference between the animations, is we have that repeat and that yo-yo. And if you put it outside of that stagger object, it's going to wait until the whole sequence of your staggers is done, and then it's going to repeat. If you have it inside that stagger object, then what it's going to do is as soon as that first element that you've decided should be the first one and to animate stops, it's going to repeat again, and everything else is going to repeat as soon as it's done. All right. So I'm going to comment out this code, and I'm going to show you some staggers. I do have the code here already just because it takes a bit of time to write all this out, and I want to make sure I get some other stuff, but we're going to talk through all the code. So the first one I have here, I've used that box class so that I could grab all of the boxes. And then I said, okay, I want to move you over -20. Here I used amount. So it's splitting up all these boxes over 0.5 seconds. So the total amount of time in seconds that gets split up among all the staggers. If I did each here and I did 0.5, this animation would be a lot slower. So if I put each here, you're going to see it animate a lot slower. So each of them are waiting 0.5 seconds before they animate. And then I have it starting. Where do I want this to start? It's starting with the first box in the array. So right here, I could do end. So it starts down here instead. I could do edges, which I didn't even realize until today was a thing. I don't know why I've never used this. It's really cool. Edges. So it's starting at the edges there. So each of the end points of the array. Or you can start like in the center, starting with that center div. Okay, and then I do have a yo-yo and a repeat here, but they are happening outside of this stagger object. So what they're doing is they're waiting for the whole stagger to stop, and then they're repeating the whole thing. So if we take this and we put it inside here instead, and I'll get an error until I add a comma, our animation is going to be a lot different. All of them are just kind of moving as soon as they're done. So the animation's a lot different than if you had that repeat on the outside. So these are all things to keep in mind when you're animating stuff, is that depending on different properties you choose, your animation can be completely different. You can change up your animation quite a bit just with a few properties. All right. And then there's another one that you all can check out when I do this link here. It's just animating the boxes up and down instead. Okay. All right. The other thing we're going to talk about is animating SVGs. It's a little different than animating just DOM elements. I do want to go through the process of how I typically animate SVGs, because it's a lot different than what you might think when you just like grab an SVG offline and or online and you're like, I'm going to animate this once you figure out SVGs. And we're going to be doing it in the context of a timeline. So we're going to look at timelines and SVGs at the same time. A timeline is different than a tween because it uses multiple tweens. They animate in sequential order unless you decide otherwise, which you can. So if you have a bunch of tweens, they'll go one after the other. And it's not dependent on the duration of the previous tween. With timeline, you have a lot more control. So anytime I'm making a complex animation, I'm reaching for timelines. And one of the reasons is they have something called timescale, which is really valuable. So you're a developer, you're trying to do an animation, and someone in your team comes back and says, that looks great. Could you speed this animation up? Or could you slow it down? Well, the problem with that usually is that you have to go in to CSS animations, like their keyframes or other JavaScript animations, and you have to tweak each tween to slow it up or speed it up or slow it down. With GreenSock, you get this thing called a timescale, and you can create your whole timeline. And then if someone wants to speed it up or slow it down, all you have to change is that timescale, and you can make the whole animation go faster or slower, which I'll show you in just a little bit. Okay, before we move on, just double checking to see if we have any questions. Okay, you mentioned fade and scale are the most performant. How do things like staggers affect performance? Is there a way to optimize this? So the stagger is just doing whatever you decide. The stagger was still just transforming. So not just fade and scale. Transforms give you scale, they give you translate, they give you rotate, and they give you skew. All of those are performant. And when you're staggering, you're just staggering. Either you're saying, okay, I want to move everything 20 pixels. You're just staggering all the elements to still do that transform. So it's still performant. Now you're animating a lot of things. So the more you animate, the more performance hit it's going to take, no matter what you do. But if I was, say, staggering a background color on all those elements, that is going to be more of a performance hit than trying to move them or just fade out the color with opacity, because that causes what's called a repaint of the browser. So the whole browser would have to repaint, and it all loads again, and that is more of a performance hit. So that was a great question. All right. So timeline is where we're at. Timeline animation. What we're going to use, again, I can't share it out, which is bumming me out a little bit, but I will show you all. I will share all of these out on Twitter afterwards. They are also in an article I have on Dev if you want to follow along. I forgot about that. I have an article. If you go to dev.to and you go to Christina Gorton or Coffee Craft Code and you find, let's see where my stuff is, challenge getting started with GSAP 3. All of these links are in there. They are in this article. So I know I can't share them out right this minute, but they are here as well. So, okay. Let me clean up a few things real quick before we keep going. All right. I have some code in here to start off initially so we can talk through it, but I don't have the timeline in here yet. So that's what we'll be going through together, is the timeline. So I'm going to uncomment out this code for a second. Actually, I'll just show you the ending code of what this should end up looking like so that you know. Let's go. There we go. Okay, I'm going to show you what I'm going to be creating for you and showing you how to create. So I have an SVG and it's got several different devices, this SVG. It's got an iPad, a phone, and just a Mac. And what I did was I animated it in. So you have it like popping in, and then you have all this other stuff on the SVG also animating. That's cool. This is stuff you can do. These are animations that a lot of people think are like super, super complex. And the first few times you do them, they probably will seem like that. But once you do them a few times, you can start taking all kinds of SVGs and doing very similar animations and making it look great. So what I want to show you first is this was an SVG I got from a designer called named Marissa. I worked with her at a company. She was an amazing designer. But one of the things I almost always have to do when I work with designers is I have to take the SVGs and I have to put them into something else, and I have to group them so that I can actually animate them. So I'm going to talk about that for a second. A very popular SVG, like where people have been getting SVGs lately, is called Undraw. So undraw.co. It is open source illustrations. You can use them for whatever. If you see a lot of startups, they probably have these illustrations. I just saw someone today who posted, hey, I have this new product, and they were using these animations, or these SVGs. So there are all kinds of SVGs. You can change the colors of them if you want up here. And then when you find one you like, you can just click on it and download. I recently found one that I was going to show you all today if I was doing a plugin, but I don't think we have time for code review. And so I clicked on it. I said, okay, I want this SVG. And then you just click download. And then what I always have to do is I have to put it in some kind of editor. Now, when I say that, people are like, oh no, like Adobe Illustrator, I don't want to pay for that. You can actually put them in something like Figma, which is free. So I'm trying to find free resources for all of you all. And I do use Figma a lot. I actually use Affinity Designer for most of my SVGs, but if I'm just grouping stuff, I use Figma. And I want to show you why I do this. So this is just the SVG that I would have gotten off, the same SVG. I put it in here yesterday so I could show you. Sorry, this one. And when you open them up, what you're going to see is you're going to see all of these, what's called a vector. It's all the little parts that they've created, they've drawn out, and they're all not named anything specific, and they're all individual. This is not great if you want to animate. So as developers, unless you work with a designer who has done code, they probably are not grouping these in a way that you can animate. Lately, I've gotten lucky and I've been working with some developers who are designers who do, so that's been fun. But what I do is I then go through and I group all the things I think I might want to animate. So like whole person, that's the whole person there, right? If I was wanting to animate that whole person, then I would group them together. And I may even like do something like group this little chunk right here and this arm so that I could rotate that arm individually if I wanted to animate it. And then I would group that together and name it. I would group something like these lines together so I could animate, like stagger them in, which I'm doing on the devices that you see. I would probably group the whole screen together because the screen wasn't grouped together. I would group all of these things and then I would export them. And something else to note is that when you are exporting in a lot of these types of things like Figma or I think even Affinity does this, you have to make sure, one, that you say SVG, and then two, you have to include ID attribute. And what that is it's all those names you've just meticulously went through and grouped and gave names to. It would get rid of those if you didn't include that. So you have to include ID attribute, and then that becomes an ID in the code that you get of the SVG. All right, any questions on that? And if you don't have questions on like that, you can always ask me later on as well on Twitter. All right, so we only have a little bit more time together. So I'm going to show you what I've done here. So another thing you can use with GreenSock is called the set property. This is something you can do in CSS if you want to. You can scale all these things down in your CSS. One of the nice things about having it staying in your JavaScript is that if someone else came in to work with your CSS and they just saw something, the CSS there, they might not know what it's for. If you have it explicitly in the JavaScript, they're going to know this is for your animation. So a lot of times, not always, sometimes I set things in the CSS, but a lot of times I will set it with GreenSock. So what I'm saying is in my code, I have an SVG. So I have my SVG here. I have gone through and I have grouped the things that I want to animate. I have given them IDs or classes depending on what they were. Like I have ID Mac here. That's that computer. And I said, okay, first I want to transform the origin, which we saw there on Mozilla. And I'm saying bottom 0 because when the devices come in, I want them all to kind of like pop up from the bottom. So when they're scaling back in, because you can see here, they say scale 0. So they're tiny. When they scale in, I want them to pop in from the bottom. And I've done that with all of the devices. So the iPad and the phone. And then I also have stuff on those particular devices. So there's all those like lines and things that I want to animate in, and I have made them scale down as well so that I can animate them in individually. So if I was doing this with a tween, I would have to go through and individually then grab each of those that I just got rid of and tween them back in, and then grab whatever else I wanted and animate that too. And with tweens, they would happen at the same time. With a timeline, you can create reusable functions, and that's like the real power behind the timeline. So because I know I'm going to be animating all of those little devices in the same way, I can create a function that has a parameter and just return that whole timeline that I have that I create. And then on a main timeline, so you have several little timelines that are inside a function, and then you create a main timeline that will then animate them all in. And I was planning on individually going in and creating these for you, but because I don't think we have enough time, I want to at least show you them and talk about them so that you get a sense of how you would do this. All right, so this function right here, it's reusable because of the item parameter. I'm using it to make several of the elements in my SVG scale back up because you saw that I set them down and I made them invisible. So I created a function, I called it visible, great naming there, and I passed in a parameter called item. The other thing you typically do when you're creating a timeline is instead of just like that gsap dot timeline and then your dot two, you're going to probably set it to a variable so that you don't have to repeat it every time when you're creating the timeline. So I say TL.2, so timeline.2, and then I pass in my item parameter so that later on I can say, okay, I want this to be the Mac. Okay, I want this to be the iPad. Okay, I want this to be the phone. All right, and then this other code is just giving it a time. So it's going to happen over 0.5 seconds. It's going to scale up to 1 because we had scaled it down to 0. And then this little property right here is the same as both opacity and visibility hidden. So a lot of times when you're animating and you have stuff hidden, you'll get this what's called a flash when you initially load your page, and you'll see all your elements. But if you set them either in GreenSock or in your CSS to visibility hidden, you won't get that flash. But then you have to then bring that back from visibility hidden to visible. And so GreenSock gives you this auto alpha that will do both the opacity 0 and the visibility hidden. And then I used the ease here, which is that kind of like elasticy, springy ease. And then the last thing I did was I returned a timeline. So I returned this timeline here. And now if we go down before we look at the other functions, we're going to see, and I'm going to get rid of a bunch of these just so it's not cluttered for a minute. Let's get it out of the way. We're going to see what I did. Okay, so down here, I'm creating this main timeline, right? I have const main equals gsap.timeline. This isn't even that important right now. We can take that out so it's not cluttering as well. And then I have this thing called a timescale, which I mentioned, which I'll manipulate in a minute to show you more. I have something called a label. This is also what makes timelines super, super powerful, is that instead of having each of them go simultaneously, one after the other, you can create what's called a label. And then you can say, a lot of times I'll label this start, just so it's easier, but shorten that down to S. That's why you see the S, because I animate all the time. I don't always like to write out start. I can say start is the beginning of the animation, and then I can say plus or equal to, and then this number is 1.1 seconds after the start of the animation. So you can decide where you want your animations to come in on the timeline by manipulating that label. So I said main.add visible, and inside there, I passed in the argument for that parameter item. So I could say iPad and get the iPad to come in instead of the Mac. I think that's, yeah, there we go, iPad. So that one's coming in. Or I could go back and have the Mac like I originally have in the animation happening first. So because I did that, I can now also, let's see, we'll just comment that out so that I don't keep deleting it. I can now use that same timeline for all of my objects. So I have .add visible, and then I passed in the Mac, and then I passed in the phone, and then I passed in the iPad. And then I said, hey, I want this to start at 1.1 seconds into the animation. This one start at 1.2. So you see them coming in just a little bit differently. Let's watch it again. So they're coming one after the other, but quicker than they would have because of the duration that I have on them. They're happening a little bit quicker because of what I set with the label here. Okay, and then I was able to use that same function. I only had to write it once, and then I was able to use it for the stuff on, say, the Mac. So we have the stuff on the Mac that's going to animate in. So you got the Mac, and then the stuff, and then stuff on the Mac animates in too. And that same kind of principle happens with all of the animations that you want to create. If you have something that you think you're going to do more than once, then you should probably create a function that's reusable for it. So you can see here I have lines twice, I have bars twice because I have different kinds of bars happening, and then I have device twice because I have the devices moving a little bit in the animation too at the end. So I've created functions for all of those. And the functions are not that much different than all of the other function that I created. The only difference between, say, like the bars and the lines versus the first function is that I did use a stagger because I was going to pass in something that had a class on a bunch of things, like all the little lines. And so I used a stagger so that the animation would be staggered. All right, so I know that was a lot to cover in a little bit of time. I think we're getting close to the end of time, so I want to make sure and see if there's questions. And if not, then we can go over some more of the code. Okay, so S, you can call, that's a good question, Kamal. So S is start of the main timeline. S is whatever you want. This really confused me when I was first starting with animations, like what in the world is this label thing? You technically can call this whatever you want, and then you can start it wherever you want in the animation. So with a main timeline like I have here, where I've created all these separate timelines, all these individual functions, and then I've decided I've returned them so that I can then use them down here. I want to have a label so that I can stagger my animations depending on when I want them to come in. In S, I typically, so I did say start because that's typically what I write. I typically write start just so that other developers working with me know what that is. But you can name this anything. You can say beginning, and then down here you would write beginning plus equal to 1. And that's because you can also have several labels. So you can have more than one label. If you had an animation, and there's lots of them on Codepen if you want to check them out, where people have this kind of like sequence of stuff where they have this whole thing happening at the beginning, and then they have this whole thing happening in the middle, and then at the end, they might have more than one label. So I typically name mine either S or start. That's just something I've found, like with working with other developers when they've had to go through my code, they know what that means. They're like, okay, this is the start of her animation, and we can go from there. So good question. Okay, so can you use this to move images, get the effect of moving across an image? So it depends on what kind of images you're talking about. If you're talking about like an actual image that you, like say you're using the image element, you can move the whole image up or down, left or right, rotate it, scale it. You can't move stuff inside the image. So I don't know if that's what you're talking about, but if you have an SVG, you can move the stuff inside that SVG. And so I think a lot of times people look at these things and they don't necessarily think it's relevant or what can they do with. What I was going to show you all today too, but I would love you all to look into now that you know how to animate, is something called scroll trigger, because this is the kind of stuff you see on the web all the time now. So scroll trigger is a plugin that you can use for free from GreenSock. It's very, what it does is, like, if you go to some of the like cooler websites and you see all this stuff like animating in on scroll, you can do that with scroll trigger. And so like I'm scrolling, let me use, here we go. I'm scrolling and this is animating in. And then I'm also animating these lines as well. And they have this trigger that they're animating in on. So this is stuff that you'll see on the web all the time now, and GreenSock makes it pretty easy with their plugins that they have. Scroll Trigger, we were lucky that this one was free. They recently, this is a newer one, and usually when you have these cool plugins that they have, they are not free, but this one was free. So definitely look into that one if you're wanting to find stuff that's maybe a little bit more relevant for the web Now, I, as a developer, have worked exclusively with GreenSock and animations like I showed you before, got paid good money for it. So you can do that as well. You can be creating crazy animations for people and you will get paid for that. So that's just something to think about as well. But I think we're about at time for questions. So if there's any like a Q&A, if you all want to hit a Q&A, you have questions for me, we can answer some questions. And I will, at Coffee Craft Code on Twitter, I will post links to all of this stuff, including the slides that I created, so that everyone has the Codepen, since you didn't have access to them in the chat.
Great. So let's see. We'll open it up to questions. Looks like I think you answered all of them wonderfully during your talk, Christina. See if any more come in. And again, if you have any questions afterwards, just feel free to get a hold of Christina. Sometimes that happens. We have a question later on.
When you actually dive into the code, sorry.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I will say, when I first started with GreenSock, though it's not like that, like it's supposed to be like the easier one. For some reason, I had this like blocker and I just like could not figure it out until I reached out to someone on Twitter, Sarah Drasner, and she helped me. And I was like, I get it now. And I went from there. So Nick, how large a library is GSAP? GSAP used to be split up into two different libraries. You would get this like Tween Max and Tween Lite because one of them was lighter. Now they say it on their website. I can't remember what it is now, but the whole reason they switched their syntax and stuff is that they've combined a ton of stuff and they're still not that large. And even as a larger library, as most libraries I feel like are nowadays, they're very performant. And so I think they have the actual like what they are on their website. I know they do with their release of version 3. Okay, and then I bet you could move an image with the effect you described by using layers. Yes, actually a really good example, you can have different layers behind each other of like, say you had some trees and then you had like grass as a foreground. So you have a background and a foreground. That scroll trigger actually does that really nicely because you can create parallax effects with the scroll trigger. And so you can create that. I think, I probably can't find it quickly, but I will also post that one. There's this really cool one where there's this car that someone did as the animation, and they did the scroll trigger and it's scrolling the car and making it look like it's moving on the screen when it's not really. They're just using the scroll trigger. So you can do that as like the images like you mentioned. Okay, I have a clarifying question about S. Would the timeline work without the label? Yes, it would. That's a good question. So I think I did take it off and you could still see the animation happening. So even though this is right here, if I just comment out this, that this S stuff isn't actually working, but you can see the animation works. What's happening is the animation's going one after the other. So the MacBook, then the phone, then the iPad, then the stuff on the Mac. If you want to tweak that so that they go a little bit closer together instead of whatever duration you initially set, which I think was 0.5 on that particular animation. So it was waiting 0.5 seconds. I can say, no, I want you to happen like one, run after the other this way. And that's what a label is good for. So yes, the animation will still work without the label. You don't have to have labels. A lot of people don't use labels. A lot of people who have to deal with animations all the time do use labels. They also have another way they do it now with GreenSock 3, which I don't really use, but I have an article about, and instead of labels, there's another way you can do it as well. So they have a lot of flexibility with the kind of stuff you can do.
Looks like we have one more question.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So it used to be very hard to add GreenSock to frameworks. They would probably say it wasn't, but it was. There was ways you had to import in like each individual thing that you were doing. Like if you had different kinds of eases, you had to import all of those. I don't know Angular specifically because I haven't used GreenSock with that, but I have used it with Vue and React, and so I imagine it's similar. You now can just import GSAP from GSAP and you have everything. The only other thing is if you're using plugins, you have to do this thing called register, which they have examples of on their website, and you register the plugin as well. But other than that, you can usually start using it. The thing that I've noticed that is harder to animate with those frameworks is that because of the way they deal with the DOM, a lot of them, you have to use refs instead of using, which most of the frameworks have more information about their own refs and how you do them. You have to use refs instead of just grabbing that individual DOM element. Oh. Thanks, Nick.
Great. I think that's all our questions. Again, if you have additional ones, get a hold of Christina on Twitter. Christina, thank you so much for hanging out with us at JavaScript Marathon. Ryan Chenke is up at 3:30 Eastern, so come on back and hang out with us. Thank you.